Hi, this is Richard Walker from Lucidate. Welcome to this video in our Introduction to Machine Learning series. In this video, we will discuss support vector machines, or SVMs. SVMs are excellent tools for both classification and regression. Regression is used when we wish to predict a numerical outcome, whereas classification is used when we want to assign data to two or more labelled groups. We might want to determine if an image is a picture of a cat or a ship based on image attributes, or, to use a more relevant financial example, to determine if a borrower is likely to pay back a loan based on terms such as debt-to-income ratio, overdraft utilisation, and net worth. In this video, we will apply support vector machines to classification tasks. We'll focus on loan default prediction as our use case. We'll train our SVM on some actual loan default data and then test it on some further real-world data that has been held back from our training set. That way we can determine how well our AI has learned to generalize and discriminate between defaulting and non-defaulting loans. I hope that the motivation is clear here. We're building a decision support tool for a credit risk officer. This tool will allow her to focus more of her attention on loan applicants that are most likely to default. The loan default dataset can be downloaded from the URL on your screen. There's also a link in the description. There are exactly 20,000 records in this dataset. The dataset has 12 inputs, and there's a mix of numeric data shown in blue, categorical data shown in red, along with the taxonomy of that category, and binary yes-no data shown in yellow. Our target variable, the category we're trying to predict, is shown in green. It's also a binary yes-no variable and shows whether this borrower has defaulted or not. As discussed, we'll use 80% of these records to train our AI, and on the 20% held back, we'll see how good our support vector machine is at predicting whether this applicant has defaulted or not. As is common with these tasks, when we look at the data in a table or a spreadsheet, there's little to guide us. If we begin some EDA, exploratory data analysis, and show scatter plots of pairs of data, we can find it hard to spot patterns. But as we add more features to our analysis, we can become more discriminating between the data and begin to understand that decision boundaries between defaulters and repayers exist. Clearly, it's difficult for us to visualize data in more than 3 dimensions, and 3 parameters is rarely enough to enforce strong decision boundaries. But this is exactly why we use support vector machines and other AI techniques. They're able to determine the optimum decision boundaries in high dimensions that characterize these complex data sets. The good news here, though, is we can explore and describe all of the useful concepts that power SVMs in just 1, 2, or 3 dimensions. So, following on from that, let's start with a simple one-dimensional classifier. We'll use debt-to-income ratio. It turns out that this is not a terrible predictor of loan default used simply on its own, but as you'd expect, we can and indeed do get far better classification results when we include more parameters. Here we have some training examples of loans that defaulted and loans that were repaid on our one-dimensional debt-to-income ratio line. As you'd expect in this sample, the loans that were large relative to the borrower's income defaulted, while the lower debt-to-income ratio loans were all paid back. So where should we put our decision boundary? Well, a conservative approach might be to take the lowest debt-to-income ratio from both our sample groups and take the midpoint. When we introduce samples from our test set, then the classifier will assign this sample to the repaid group as it's to the left of our orange decision boundary. It will assign this sample to the defaulted group as it's to the right of the orange boundary. But it will also assign this test sample to the defaulted group. This seems wrong, as this sample is much closer to the repaid group than the defaulted group. Moving our decision boundary to the midpoint of our training samples seems like the right approach, and here we get a correct classification. Sadly, the midpoint of the training samples is almost always not the best choice. Let's understand why. Firstly, there's clearly a lot of room between the two samples. We have a lot of freedom to specify our decision boundary. We can move it closer to the defaulted group or closer to the repaid group. The smallest distance between the decision boundary and the closest test sample is called the margin. We maximize the margin when the boundary is at the midpoint between our training samples. So why isn't this necessarily the best point? The reason is generalization and outliers. Let's say we have an outlier in our test data. The debt to income ratio at this point lies very close to the defaulted group. Yet this borrower repaid their loan. If we use this outlier to set the decision boundary, then we will have a very, very low margin. And this is unlikely to be what we want. We can easily see why. If one of our defaulted test samples is to the left of this decision boundary, then it will be misclassified. Whereas a decision boundary that ignores this outlier will produce a correct classification. This is an example of the so-called bias variance trade-off, which frankly plagues machine learning. To get a solution to generalize, we'd like to ignore this outlier and set a decision boundary that's based on our modal observations. What we want is the ability to ignore some outliers to give us a wider margin. This is called soft margin classification. Support vector machines allow you to control soft margins with a classification parameter called C. High values of C will result in a very tight margin with few outliers, but likely a model that won't generalize well. Small values of C will have many outliers, but a wider margin. Training a support vector machine will require a grid search with many values of the classification hyperparameter C to determine which value performs optimally. To gain further intuition, let's look at this outlier in more detail. Thus far, our example has only used one parameter, debt to income ratio. Credit officers tend to be more canny than that and would look at a wider variety of input parameters. So if we introduce another, a wealth measure such as net worth or bankable assets, then when we include this, our data point no longer looks like so much of an outlier. We now have a 2D data set. We can draw a straight line between this data set with a wide margin. And we'll add other dimensions to our data set. In this case, we're adding an overdraft utilisation parameter. Now our data is in 3D and the decision boundary becomes a 2D plane in this 3D space. Again, here you can see a wide margin between the defaulted and the loan repaid groups. So a key point to consider here is data coverage. With a single parameter, debt to income ratio, we would expect outliers. We don't have enough parameters to effectively discriminate. But will we ever have sufficient data coverage? Looking at all the input parameters again, we have a large set of parameters, but hardly exhaustive. Factors that we might never be able to legally or ethically capture, think about borrowers' gambling proclivity or drug addiction. These might well have a high degree of influence on whether a loan was repaid or not. Therefore, to account for crucial but missing parameters, we should be tolerant of outliers. And again, fortunately, support vector machines account for this and allow us to experiment with different values of our classification hyperparameter C to give us soft margin classification. Another great feature of support vector machines is that they do not require the data to be linearly separable. Take a look at this one-dimensional data set. No matter where we put the decision boundary point on this line, we can't ever get a separation between the two classes of data. But what if we adopt an alternative perspective? What if we transform the data by squaring it? Now we can draw a straight line that clearly separates the data. Support vector machines can effectively find flat lines or flat hyperplanes in higher dimensions that can separate the data. Here's a 2D example. There's no one-dimensional line that can split the 2D data into the two correct groups. However, if we transform the data into 3 dimensions, we can easily segment the data with a flat plane. So, how does our SVM perform on the training data? Well, it's not perfect, but the results are commendable. We used 16,000 of our records, if you recall, for training the support vector machine, and held back 4,000 data points to test. And we can see the results of our test in this confusion matrix. Correct results are in the upper right and lower left quadrants. In the upper right, the SVM correctly identified defaulters. In the lower left, the SVM correctly identified repayers. The other two quadrants, the SVM got it wrong. Here we see false positives and false negatives. Our best results show an accuracy of over 81%. This type of information can help credit officers in focusing their attention on the applicants most likely to default. In summary, support vector machines, or SVMs, are an example of a supervised learning technique. They can be used for both classification and regression. In this video, we focused solely on the classification capabilities. SVMs seek to determine a multi-dimensional hyperplane that separates data. For linearly separable data, the dimensionality of the hyperplane will be 1 less than the number of parameters. However, if the data is not linearly separable, then SVMs can introduce higher dimensional hyperplanes to separate the data. SVMs are robust and capable of generalizing. To do this, they utilize soft margin classification. This seeks to strike a balance between keeping the margin as wide as possible while limiting the number of outliers in the training data that violate the margin. This is Richard Walker from Lucidate. Many thanks for watching this AI explainer. To learn more about AI and machine learning and their application to capital markets, please visit Lucidate at www.lucidate.co.uk.